morning. Thank you for having me. I also was editor for this journal when I was a student here, so I'm very excited to be part of the Symposium. As John was mentioned, my name is Gabrielle Rejouis, and I'm a legal fellow at United First Step. United First Step organizes Amazon, Walmart, and retail employees owned by private equity companies. I'm also a distinguished fellow with the Center for Practical Technology. And I'm going to be speaking a little bit about some of the research, speaking from some of the research that I did for the conference that John mentioned. Something that is very important to think about and to understand when we're talking about worker surveillance is that it's not a new phenomenon. This is something that dates back further back than when we think about the introduction of digital technology, further back than when we think about factories, Taylorism. And so it's important for us to have that history in mind to ground our understanding of both the phenomenon of worker surveillance, but also when we're thinking about policy responses to that phenomenon. And it's important to keep that in mind that worker surveillance isn't new when thinking about, to make sure that we're thinking about the ways the impacts are similar, so we're not inventing or ignoring the existing policies that we can use to address these problems. So to start thinking about some of the history, I always start with the plantation, the American plantation. It's important to acknowledge the ways that American work is very much so influenced by what occurred on the plantation in America. Two scholars that I want to highlight in this portion of my talk is Simone Brown and her book Dark Matters, as well as Bill Cook's article connecting how plantation influences American management today. It's important for plantations to be a part of this conversation because of the similarities behind how data was used to fuel discussions and decisions to drive profit. Profit drove the innovations of surveillance and control on the plantation. When it was a matter of determining how much product needed to be harvested, in determining which individuals, which enslaved Africans, to be specific, were the most profitable, in decisions about where to place workers on the field. These were all things that were driven by collection of data via surveillance, and also the calculations that were then being done by the accountants on the plantation. There's a sort of myth or misunderstanding of plantations that they were crude, or that they weren't very sophisticated, but in fact, when you look at how much work went into determining how to make the profit expand and increase, we can see that there was a very sophisticated and very intentional design on the plantation and in the management of the plantation. Enslaved Africans were incredibly controlled, both their coming and going, on the plantation itself, but then also in the work that they were doing. So they were told what their quota was, and they had no way of knowing their progress towards that quota until the end of the day. And that is where, again, data is coming into play, where if enslaved Africans did not meet their quota, then they were experiencing extremely violent discipline. Enslaved Africans themselves would say that for every pound that they were off of their quota, they would receive a lash of the whip. And so data is being used to determine what is profit, how to achieve that profit, and then being used to justify our discipline. The next historical account that I want to talk about is the FBI surveillance of the United Farm Workers during the 60s and 70s. And so it might seem a little odd to talk about the government when thinking about worker surveillance, but it's important to name that for a lot of communities, including working communities, the distinction between private surveillance and public surveillance or government surveillance is not really a distinction that they experience. We can also imagine for immigrant communities and communities of color that experience a lot of interactions with the government, that whether or not it's your employer doing that surveillance, or the government doing that surveillance, or your neighbor doing that surveillance, or the government doing that surveillance, it really doesn't matter when the impact is being done through the state. And so just wanting to highlight that for a lot of surveillance activists in the context of the criminal legal system or immigration, that line between corporate surveillance or private surveillance and public surveillance is a very porous line. And so the FBI was surveilling the United Farm Workers under the attempt to root out communism within the group. They were receiving a lot of tips. Some scholars predict that it was employers who were giving these anonymous tips to the FBI. They were communists who were part of the United Farm Workers. And so please do something about it, because we don't really want to engage with them in bargaining over increasing their wages. And so while this is a pretext, or this was a pretext for their surveillance, it's important to name that this, again, is an instance where employers are using the government to disrupt employee organizing. And so flash forward to today, when we think about farm workers who are coming from immigrant communities, and they aren't being paid their wages, or there's other issues of sexual harassment, naming the gambit of things that employment and labor law protects. The employer can always say, or I should say, the employer sometimes will say, "Oh, we know that you're undocumented, or we know that there's an issue where you don't want to have a run with ICE, so we're going to use, again, the government enforcement of laws to disrupt your organizing, or to disrupt your ability to get access to your rights." So why is it important to have this history in mind? It's important because today there have been a lot of efforts to address the surveillance of workers, and it's been very focused on the technology being used. But it's missing the point, right? Like, this surveillance was happening before the introduction of artificial intelligence, before automated management. And so if we're only looking at the technology, we're ignoring the ways that managers can still enact the same harms that were occurring before this technology was introduced into the workplace. Another issue is that by only focusing on the technology, we're not considering the ways that the surveillance has occurred before. A lot of the legislation to address surveillance is leaving out independent contractors. For example, gig workers or workers who are in half-based economies. And that's a problem because they're both more precarious, but also they are the ones who are overexposed to the surveillance and the impacts of the surveillance. So in closing, I just want to name some proposals that I think that would be a better solution to address these issues of worker surveillance, both in the use of digital technology, with the use of digital technology, or without the use of digital technology. First is that we need to give workers more autonomy. Surveillance is fundamentally a challenge to worker autonomy, and so if we expand that autonomy, then we can reduce the ability of employers to use surveillance against workers. The next proposal is to preserve existing rights, protections against dangerous workplaces, against interference with the right to unionization, freedom from discrimination are just some examples of rights and protections that workers have already and need to be expanded, and enforcers need to make sure that they're thinking about the ways that technology are interfering with some of these existing rights. And then the last proposal is to abolish the surveillance of workers altogether. There are ways that employers can be profitable without making it impossible for workers to have the time to take rest, to practice their religious rights. There are certain things that should just not be allowed to ensure that workers are being protected in the workplace.